Hello and welcome to Property Matters. I'm Stephen Galpin, and today we're going to be talking about the government's new English Renters Reform Bill. This is a bill that's being put before Parliament this month and is hopefully going to change the face of the rental market in this country. I have to say I've got my doubts, but to help us through this, understand it and go through the various changes that are going to happen, I'm joined by Jermyn, who's CEO and solicitor at Woodstock Legal Services. They're residential landlord and tenant law specialists, and I can't think of anybody better to help us through this. Thank you, Stephen. My pleasure. Okay, well look, Carly, I just want to sort of set the ground rules in a way. I desperately don't want to get into terribly complex conversations about sections of the law and this, that and the other. I want it to be of help to our viewers and to maybe answer some of the questions that are worrying them about their tenancies, and indeed landlords who are worried about their investments too, because I think it does affect sort of both sides of the fence. And I think the first and probably most important effect of this new bill, as and when it comes in, and we'll discuss that later, is the no fault eviction regulations, which is effectively abolishing Section 21 and strengthening up Section 8. And we'll come to what that means in a moment. But effectively, if I've read things correctly, what it means is that unless there are a specific set of circumstances, and we'll talk about what they are in a moment, a landlord is not going to be able to evict a tenant. So once you've taken a tenant on, you've got him or her.
Yeah, and the aim, the whole aim of this is to provide a fairer and more stable private rental sector so that you don't have short 6-month tenancies. And people, create more stability in communities, and tenants, have the confidence that unless there are reasons to be evicted, that they, will be able to remain in the property. So essentially what you're creating is periodic tenancies that continue unless they're terminated by a landlord for a valid reason or the tenant chooses to terminate.
Okay, well, we'll come to the valid reasons for termination in a minute, but can I just go back to the principle of this? At this time, unless I'm mishearing all the information we get from agents and various professionals, there is a huge crisis in the rental market, a minus of stock. Okay?
Huge, yeah.
Okay, which is forcing up rents, which is causing even more trouble within the cost of living crisis. Now, if I go back, I'm a lot older than you, so I can go back to the late 80s very easily, and under Margaret Thatcher's reign, we brought in what's called a short-old tenancies, which have lasted until this time. And basically they were introduced to add stock to the housing market simply because at that time, if you let your property out, you could never get it back. So these were to give surety to the landlord that they could get their property back after the term, and to give at the same time the tenant surety of that term. So if you rent for 12 months, that's what you got. In, out, finish. Okay, which goes with my sort of ethos of this sort of thing. You both sign a lease, so why don't you just both do what it says? My life's very simple. Yours is a lawyer, so you can't be simple. But so that sort of went with that ethos. There you are. You know what you've signed. In, out, all over. Yeah. But we're going back now to the state where landlords, once they've let their property, aren't going to be able to get it back unless there are some very specific reasons. Now, surely this is going to drive even more people from the buy-to-let investment market.
I think the fear around it might do. I think when you actually pull it apart, the removal of Section 21, on the face of it, is not a concern for me. I've never acted on an eviction where someone's just decided to evict for no apparent reason. There is a reason. And what the new legislation is looking to do is to take away Section 21, but make sure that they're evidencing that reason and not just using a no-fault eviction where the tenant doesn't have an opportunity to respond or the landlord doesn't have to prove their grounds. The concern is, I think, particularly for me, somebody who's had years of experience dealing with the courts and has watched them progressively get slower and slower, that actually all of those evictions aren't going anywhere. They're just being done in a different way. And you'll need your day in court, you'll have to establish grounds, you'll have to, follow the right process. And that's going to take up a considerable amount of court time in a system that's already under a huge amount of stress and can't cope with the volume they've got at the moment. So that's my concern. And I can see why other landlords may be concerned. But the reality is, for every single valid reason that anyone really used a Section 21, the idea is that the grounds will be, drafted in such that they still have opportunity to gain possession.
Well,
but it may just take longer.
Well, it will take longer. And I mean, you mentioned the court process there. I mean, I've sat in magistrates court for 16, 17 years. And the time it takes to get a case before the court in its fullest guise is a long time. It could be 12 months. And then perhaps you get a defendant who says, oops, terribly sorry, I know it's court day today, but I've got backache, so I can't do it. You're delayed. So you're delayed another 12 months. Then they come back to court and say, oh, well, of course, the witnesses will be unreliable now. We need this dismissing, really. And I think you're going to get this in the housing market. Now, it's not going to apply to everybody, because I think the majority of tenants are good tenants, the majority of landlords are good landlords. And I worry that this legislation is really a bit of a sort of sledgehammer to crack a nut, because I think you could be more focused on what's bad in the market, focus on that and try and get it right, rather than this one-size-fits-all sort of kind of legislation. I mean, I was with somebody at breakfast this morning who's quite big and well respected in the property market, and he said, don't these people realise if you're a good landlord, 9 times out of 10 you'll get a good tenant? And it's only a very small percentage that abuse the system or try and manipulate it. I mean, am I right?
And the numbers are small of those with difficulty, so I think it's about retaining some perspective. And you're right, good landlords do tend to attract good tenants, but even good tenants fall on hard times, and landlords need to be able to have a resolution so they can gain possession of their property. And there are the odd tenant that has no intentions of paying rent. We've seen them again and again. It is a concern for landlords, and it is huge change. It's one of the biggest changes we've seen for generations. So that's why it's so important, why it's attracting so much attention and so much emotion from landlords and tenants.
Okay, so just on this Section 21 then, before we just move on to a slightly different aspect of this new legislation. So on the Section 21, you are going to be able to give notice to your tenant under certain circumstances, and those circumstances are? So,
rent arrears, which we've always had. Interestingly, they've introduced a new ground for rent arrears, which I think is, a bit of a win for landlords. So it'll be interesting to see how often they can use it. But the issue we had with the original, they call it Ground 8, where there were 2 months rent arrears. They had to be in 2 months arrears at the date you served notice and at the date of the hearing. Quite often you would get, tenants quite aware of that requirement and would dip just below. So you get to your hearing date and the judge has some discretion as to whether they order possession. And if they're just under, it's, they're making an order to make somebody homeless at the end of the day. So it's a big decision, 10-minute hearing, they've got to be quick, and so they will err on the side of caution and normally go the tenant's way. And you'd see tenants constantly dip below that 2 months to make sure they didn't get caught by that provision. But what they've got now, which may help, and the proof will be in the pudding, is where they are in 2 months rent arrears, 3 times in 3 years, something along those lines. So that's helpful. And the other, they're introducing a ground that if you're going to sell the property, that can't be used in the first 6 months. And then there's fines if what they're trying to avoid is sort of backdoor eviction. So they pretend they're going to sell and actually they don't. They just let to another tenant. Might be quite difficult to monitor for prosecutions and fines, that sort of thing. But that ground is there. There's also a ground for letting it to family members. And actually, I looked at the legislation; it's quite wide. So it can be a spouse or someone you're living with in a civil partnership, or even not an official partnership, as if you were married or in a civil partnership. Children, grandchildren, siblings. So it's fairly wide of who you can actually apply that to. Again, you can't do it until after the first 6 months. So at least tenants have that first 6 months. And again, there's fines and prosecutions if you abuse that. So
okay. So I mean, I know with certain judges that on Section 8, for instance, where at the moment we say if you're 3 months plus in arrears, Section 8 comes in. They will say we have no discretion. We must just
It's mandatory ground.
Yeah.
So that's mandatory.
Yeah. Okay. But this is going to change to something a little bit more flexible.
Yeah, with just the introduction of the other ground, but that will be mandatory if you can establish that. So you won't have to, at the current situations, if you don't satisfy that 2 months, you've got discretionary grounds. But, it's very difficult. And I never encourage landlords to go on discretionary grounds because, like I say, you've got a 10-minute hearing. It's a big decision to be made on the day. So, if you can satisfy those mandatory grounds with really good evidence, and that's what people will need. It's making sure that they've done the proper notice, they've gathered everything for court, and that they've given that judge everything they need so that in 10 minutes, which is really quick, that they can hear your case, hear a tenants if they turn up, hear their representative if they turn up, if they're there to support, and actually they make the decision in your favour on that day. So that's why the sort of the planning element to go into these possession proceedings becomes very important.
And under the new legislation, is this still going to be the county court that deals with this?
Yes.
Okay. So what about the time that it takes to get that hearing in the county court? I
mean, that's my concern. And they're talking about reform. I think huge investments needed. They're talking about digitalising it. At the moment, we do...
What does digitalising court mean? I mean,
it's quite vague, isn't it? Yeah, it is quite vague.
I've had all this in the criminal courts.
Yeah, and at the moment, if we're issuing a claim for rent arrears, we use a system called Possession Claims Online, which actually is not bad. And you put your claim on there, and then you normally get your hearing date as soon as you issue online.
Okay.
That used to be about 6 weeks when you issued. And I'd be like, right, there's my hearing date in 6 weeks' time. Now it varies very considerably. It can't be less than 6 weeks. Most of the time, on average, it's about 3 months, if not more. And then will they adapt that system to allow you to issue other claims on there? They should, because other claims will just be slower to issue because they're being posted, snail mail, and then you're waiting for a judge and, the office to go through it and get it issued. That's really, really, really slow. So hopefully, all claims can be issued online. I'd love to see the ability to track your claims online. We quite often claims and orders, etc. We're chasing courts, but my team will spend hours on the phone. In fact, we have people allocated to call one particular court asking several questions on several different cases a day, so that we can get updates to people because they're that slow. So the amount of reform required is huge, and that's probably my biggest concern, not the removal of Section 21.
Okay, on that happy note, we're going to go to a break. So join me again after the break when I'll be asking Carly more questions about the new legislation. Hello and welcome back to part 2 of Property Matters. I'm Stephen Galpin and I'm with Carly Jermyn, solicitor at Woodstock Legal Services. So Carly, we've established we're getting rid of Section 21.
Yep.
And it's all going to be focused on Section 28. And
Section 8, yeah.
Section 8 and the grounds under Section 8. As we were talking off camera and I said I think judges have had a little discretion under Section 8, have they?
Depends on the grounds. Yeah, so different grounds. Some grounds are mandatory and some are discretionary.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we've got
Whereas Section 21, as long as everything was in order, you got your possession.
Right. Okay. So the difference with Section 8 is going to be what? These grounds are clearly specified, and if you satisfy one, or is it just one, or any number of them? Or
I'd always recommend that anyone serving a notice, if they've got more than one to rely on, they rely on more than one, because that kind of, if you don't establish one, you can establish the other. But yeah, it just needs to be one ground, and you need to make sure that you've ticked all of the boxes and you've got that relevant evidence.
Right. So we'll test your memory now. So let's go through what the grounds are.
Yeah. So there's the rent arrears ones that we talked about, the introduction of that slightly more flexible one for landlords.
Now that means if you're in arrears more than a couple of times in what,
3 years,
3 years, is it?
Yeah.
That
you
would
hit that
give you
2 month
grounds.
threshold. Yeah.
But the problem with that is that then if it takes you months to get to court, so you're going to be heading towards 3 or 4 years before.
Well, you mean if they start to have a clean sheet and they run up to court? Yeah. But, they'll probably look back at the history into when the notice was served. But that's a really important point is, where will the, timing start and stop?
Will a court, so let's have a hypothetical. You owe 10,000 quid's worth of rent, which represents, your 2 or 3 months, whatever it is. Yeah, you get to the day before court, you pay £2,000 off, so you don't hit the threshold. Yeah. What's the court's view of that? Do they want to see when you paid it?
No, I think they'll just look at what's owed. at the moment you're relying on grounds 10 and 11, because it'd be, if you're not hitting that ground 8 of 2 months rent arrears, they look at discretionary grounds and they'll look at all of the factors.
Okay.
So, you know, you'll be pushing for everything. It's quite rare to get an order on that. And actually what you're more like at the moment to get is a suspended possession order, where there's a payment plan. They've got to clear the arrears by a certain date, otherwise you will get your possession order. So that's what we tend to push for at the moment.
Right.
I think the introduction of the new rent arrears ground might give us another avenue to just get possession on the day if they've cleared a little bit, but there's still been that history of late payments and underpayments.
So I mean, I've sat and heard with a number of judges who said, Section 8, I've got no discretion. I must give.
It's mandatory.
I must give the order.
Yeah.
But what are you saying? If there is some question and there's perhaps a payment plan in place, an opportunity to put things right over the period of time, has he then got discretion?
No, if they're still in 2 months rent arrears,
so they give the order, but they suspend it.
No, if they've hit the 2 months, they have to give the order. There's no discretion. They must. The legislation says they must give possession. So if you can, establish at court on that day that the evidence is there that they are in 2 months rent arrears and they were at the time of serving the notice and at that day on that hearing, then they must give an order.
Okay, irrespective of an agreed payment plan.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, that's fine. So more grounds.
Antisocial behaviour, and I think that's been one that's been in the press a lot. Huge concern about landlords' ability to gain possession for property where there's antisocial behaviour. It's quite a complex issue because the issues you have are pressure from, if you're in a block, so pressure from the other leaseholders and from the freehold management company, if you've got a tenant in there that is causing antisocial behaviour. And it can be quite difficult to go to court to get possession on that ground at the moment.
Well, as a landlord, you're not physically seeing that antisocial behaviour yourself, are you?
No, you're relying on reports from neighbours, the community, police. So it almost takes an army to get rid of people like that and have to work together, which can be really difficult because, like I say, you've got to go to court and you've got to prove that ground. And that's why people would have used perhaps Section 21, because they didn't have to prove that ground. Because if you think about it, the people that are going to be there to give you evidence are going to be the neighbours, who might be quite concerned about giving evidence about their current neighbours, particularly if the court claim fails and they're welcomed back into the property or they remain in the property and they have to live alongside these people. It can be really difficult. So they're really challenging claims. And actually, most of the time, quite often they come hand in hand with rent arrears. But quite often that would be where you'd say, look, just use Section 21. No one has to go to court. No one has to give evidence. And it keeps people out of it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So some of the other grounds, I think if your mortgage provider is repossessing or selling the property, that would be a legitimate reason, wouldn't it?
Yeah. And if the lease, if the freeholder is forfeiting the lease, taking back possession. If you're redeveloping, is another one, which is useful, actually.
I was just going to say, on redevelopment, what's the criteria there? Because redevelopment is quite a broad phrase, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And times we've relied on those is where you've got perhaps housing disrepair claims, because they can become quite tricky. For example, so if you've got a tenant in the property, they're alleging housing disrepair, and the landlord may say, housing disrepair, but I need possession to be able to do the works. Or tenants are really difficult and have not allowed access to do the works, and that's the times when we would rely on those. So it is useful. But, so if there's an improvement order made, you could gain possession on that ground. So if the local authority say, actually, the property's not up to standard, here's an improvement order, you could rely on that as a ground to gain possession, so that you can get the work up to standard.
I can see a big cloud on the horizon here. We're soon going to have legislation that says you're going to have to improve the insulation and energy rating for your flat or house.
Yeah.
Okay. You have an existing tenant, but as a landlord, you're obliged to do it. Would that be a grounds for giving notice?
Potentially. And, with all of this, there's still a massive journey for this legislation to go on, and there is a lot of detail lacking. And, we're all saying it constantly when we talk about the reforms, but the devil will be in the detail. And, there's lots of complexities around that. So, there's going to be satellite litigation around these. It's all very interesting. So,
I think I'm getting to the stage where I sort of say to the government, good luck with this.
It's tricky. It is tricky.
It is tricky, isn't it? Because I think the other thing is, again, in property TV here, we hear from a lot of different professionals and people in the industry, and they're all sort of being a little bit nervy about all this legislation, tenants, landlords, investors. But we've got to remember, this isn't going to come in for ages.
You've got time. You've got time. Yeah, and you've got to, I'd always say to, landlords, it's about, making sure you understand what lies ahead or what potentially lies ahead. Look at your portfolio. Look at your resources that you have. Do you have a good agent? If you don't, go and find a good agent, because they're worth their weight in gold. Some agents are better than others, but, it's not as scary as some people think.
No.
But like you say, we've got a lot of time to adapt. And if you're a good landlord and you get your, ducks in a row, your house in order, so many cliches in there, but it's true. They've just got to get prepared and making sure they've got the knowledge, the resources and the team around them to be able to deal with it as a business. And that's where I think it's difficult, because I think it's, your accidental or one-off landlords that are juggling this alongside something else. Actually, it's a proper business, requires a lot of focus, the standards are high, it's highly regulated, so you need the support and you need to get things in order.
Yes, I do worry a lot of this legislation, not particularly in relation to this particular bill, but I just mentioned there the energy efficiency ratings. For instance, you're a buy-to-let landlord. We're in a cost of living crisis. Interest rates have shot up.
Yes.
Your margin might have gone to almost zero, if not into negative.
That's quite common. Yeah.
Where do you get the money to do this retrospective work? On insulation, on windows, on lofts.
Yeah, I mean, there are grants available. There are certain, I don't know,
grants,
there are, but it's pretty limited. So, and that's a concern. We're in a country where there's lots of older properties, and they're beautiful, the older properties. So it'd be really frustrating if they were no longer available on the market, and we've got a huge supply issue.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, we've touched on some of the more sort of serious grounds for getting possession. So let's take the abolition of Section 21, the widening of Section 8. What's your view, Carly, of the effect on the market of this particular sector of the bill?
I think it's mostly fear about it. And like I say, if you've got a good team around you, you've got good systems and processes, every time you needed to have gained possession or wanted to under a Section 21, you should be able to, if you do it properly and you do it correctly. So I don't think it's a huge concern, but I can see the fear around it, and people think, oh, this is too much. I'm done. There's easier ways to invest. There's easier ways to, make money. But there will be others that say, bring it on. I know what I'm doing. I'll get my house in order and I can tackle it, and I'm confident I can tackle it.
Yes.
And those landlords will do quite well, I think.
I think this does come back to sort of, good landlords attract good tenants.
Yes.
I think that's the ethos really that matters, isn't it? But there is this exodus of people from the buy-to-let market, and that is worrying because it is causing huge pressure on the rental rates, isn't it? Yeah,
and I think a lot of that's to do with how long this bill has taken to come in, and people waiting for the detail, and just people need certainty, and we're still not quite going to get certainty for a very long time. So, and that's been the concern.
Well, I think we're not a country who lives on certainty, are we? Whether it's investment or not.
Lately.
I can remember years and years ago, I went over to Japan and I met the boss of Honda, and I said, from within my lifetime, you've gone from a tiny little company to being a sort of worldwide conglomerate. And he said, yes. He said, because the Japanese government gave me 25-year fixed rate money. So I could plan. I could hedge my bets against inflation, against currency fluctuations, and that really was key to their success. And I think that is what's needed in the property market at the moment. I've got developers here that have started developments in terms of the foundations, and who've now put the project on hold for 2 or 3 years until they believe the price of materials settles down, the cost of living prices settles down, inflation stops, hopefully. And there we are. But look, that's it. So again, we're going to go to another break, Carly, and after the break, we'll talk about some of the perhaps more controversial points of the bill. See you soon. Hello and welcome back to part 3 of Property Matters. Carly, we've talked about probably the most critical part of the bill, which is to do with your security of tenure and everything else. And I have to say, in general, I'm all for tenants having security, but I equally want to see landlords be secure in the way that they're treated. And one of the slight issues that I can see, this conversion of assured short-hold tenancies to periodic tenancies as a matter of an automatic transfer. In the bill it says the tenant, if wanting to leave the property from that periodic tenancy, would have to give 2 months' notice.
Yeah.
And they say that's because it's fair on the landlords to give him time to find a new tenant, etc., etc. Yeah, but hold on a minute. If the tenant can give 2 months' notice, why can't the landlord give 2 months' notice?
Yeah, I know. And does it feel unfair? But it's about creating stability for the tenant. Yeah, and as a landlord, I can see that view, and I think landlords will be concerned because it used to be 1 month, but obviously after the fixed term had expired, so you've got 2 months, so it's a little bit more. But I was hoping to see a restriction on that in the first, say, 4 months, which I haven't yet. But like I say, there's still time. And I think if we're pushing for stability, it does need to work both ways. And the concern is, this all has impact on things like the Airbnb market as well, when you think about it. Why would you go and pay inflated Airbnb prices if you could just take out, a periodic tenancy and give 2 months notice the day you walk in and you've got, a nice little Airbnb for the summer somewhere. Yeah. So it, all has knock-on impact. And yes, I would have liked to have seen that prohibited for at least a period of time to give landlords more stability. The reality is we are in a market where landlords can go and find a new tenant because they're queuing up at the door quite quickly. So actually landlords should be fine in this market, but if the market changes, that may be more of a concern. So I'd like to see people continuing to put pressure on to perhaps have a little bit of a gap for landlords so they've got confidence there at the beginning of the tenancy. I'm just not keen to see anything that restricts investment in property. Yeah, I understand that. You see, I mean, in years gone by, I've been out in Singapore, in Kuala Lumpur and Hong Kong selling property, and most of those properties were for investment in the UK, and the overseas buyers have always been very confident with UK legislation. My money's safe. It's if I bought the property, it's not like buying something in Russia where you might or might not get the title deeds, or you might equally get somebody knocking on the door saying, well, you thought you bought it, but you haven't. We're not that kind of country. No. And that's great. But I just feel that we're just heading a little bit back to too much bias towards the tenant, really. And I like act for landlords. So I make no secret if I think the pendulum has swung too far. But, it's a bit scary for some landlords, and perhaps it does cause a lot of uncertainty when it comes to investment. And I will always encourage landlords to try and really look at this as an investment, and this is your asset, and it's a business, and they have to put their business hats on. And yes, you have to assess it commercially. And if it's not the right investment for you, it's not. Right. Now I'm going to move on to a subject now in this legislation which I really don't like. And it's called pets in lets. Yeah. Now, why don't I like it? Look, I think the market has two sectors here. We have the big institutional landlord that might buy a whole block of flats. It's an investment. So they take the most popularist clauses, put them in there, anything that's attractive to the tenant, anything that they as landlords can live with that's not going to cause them a problem, and that's fine. But we also have a huge army of landlords that own 1 or 2 properties. We all know that they can't put a buy-to-let property into a pension scheme, but there is nothing to stop you having a buy-to-let property as your pension. No, and quite often they are. And they are. Yeah. Now, what that also means is that those smaller landlords probably are much more emotive and caring about the property that they've invested in. And here we are, the government saying, you've got to let pets in here. Now, I don't like sort of dogs and cats, and I would kick like mad about letting one in my home. The building that I live in, the head lease prohibits them anyway. It actually says all pets. I suppose even if you've got a goldfish, I suppose you're in breach if you've got it. But I would object to the government saying to me, I've got to let dogs in my flat. Now, I know the new legislation is going to say, right, the obligation is for the landlord to consider an application, and he has, I think, 42 days in which to make that choice. But you see, the decision I would make, I'd say, yes, I'm going to consider it, and the answer is no. But you can't. Well, tell me. So it will be implied It'll be an implied term of the contract that consent will be given unless you have reasonable grounds to refuse. So it's flipped on its head. I don't stay with you on this one. I have to admit, and I've dealt with hundreds and hundreds of claims to do with possession, rent arrears recovery, damage to properties. It's quite rare that pets are a problem. And what they're looking to do, and I think this encourages stability. Actually, there's a lot of information out there to show that people that do have pets tend to be better tenants. So blocks are a different point, and I'll come to that. But what they're doing is they're amending the Tenant Fees Act so that what landlords will be able to do is require insurance, and they'll be able to take control of that insurance and deduct payment.
Let me just stop you there. Just looking at the wording in the legislation on that, it says that either the landlord may be able to require the tenant to take out insurance or accept the landlord's insurance.
Yes.
But I just wonder how many arguments you're going to, I don't want that insurance policy, I want this one, that one's too expensive, this is...
Yeah, and again, I talked about satellite litigation and little mini disputes all the time. And this is where you'll get, because again, the devil is in the detail. And it's, is that, premium necessary? Is that policy too wide? Why do I need to pay that? They were talking about one dog here, not, and that will be an area for disputes, I think, and concern.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is it is a practical matter, and I worked on a development just down the road here, which very similar very visually very similar to this one. You can see just over your left shoulder outside, and effectively it's a 3-sided glass box, and we see pets in there. We see them scraping at the window and barking because their owners have gone out all day. They've left the dog or the cat in the flat. They don't want to put the comfort cooling on and leave it running all day because it's quite expensive. And I can't tell you the amount of times we had to call the RSPCA to pets that were being quite noisy and obviously in distress. Now, whilst people say, well, I'm anti-pets, and that's not very nice and all the rest of it, I'm also not very keen on seeing pets in distress.
No, and I quite agree. And that will be another thing to people to consider. And you've just pointed out, there with the barking, that sort of thing, there is another avenue for people to look at, and that's nuisance and annoyance. And, are you causing a nuisance and annoyance to other people in the block? So the pet may be permitted, but that doesn't mean you can, they can run wild.
But Carly, you know, from a practical point of view, you've got a tenant with a dog. I mean, what do you do? Tell them to, throw the dog out of the window or sell it or whatever else,
it's incredibly difficult. I mean, that is, you could potentially look at possession for that, but it would be incredibly difficult. I take your point. One thing we have to talk about is the fact that with leasehold properties, if it's prohibited by your lease, then that is, gives you recourse to reasonably refuse.
Yes. Okay. Now, if the landlord does refuse you permission, and there's two clear elements here, isn't there? If you've got an existing tenant with an existing pet, that's one argument. Yeah. If it's for a new tenancy, for a new property that you're letting out, you might refuse or I suppose just choose another applicant, in other words. And you feel particularly aggrieved about this. Where do you go with the complaint?
Well, you start looking at the redress scheme, which is, is
this the ombudsman?
Yeah. And I suspect that's the sort of venue that lots of these minor little concerns will, be considered in.
Okay. So, I mean, you're not as dismal as I am about this clause, are you? You think there is probably protection there in one way or another?
Yeah. And I think the amount of times it's breached anyway, and I think most of the time people do just sneak in a pet anyway. And actually it's never as big a problem, I think, as people.
I sit in the bar, people say, to the concierge, look, can't I bring a dog in? It's only this big. And then of course the next one comes and says, well, mine's only that big. Again, I come to this business of leases, you signed your lease, you've read the clauses, just do what it says. It says
and
no dogs,
that
no
protection
dogs.
Is there.
Okay, well, that's fairly good. Now, I mentioned there the ombudsman scheme. So we're going to have an ombudsman for private landlords.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Does that exclude, shall we say, I mean, there's a huge department store, isn't there, that's suddenly gone into investment in buy-to-let. So is that considered, is the word private to do with private sort of commercial tenancies, or does it mean the smaller private
No,
landlord?
all of them, all landlords. It'll be
All
obligatory.
landlords.
Yeah, and they'll all be
Okay.
on there.
So they all have to sign up
Yeah.
to this ombudsman
Yeah,
scheme?
and a fee to be paid.
Really? And what's
Yes.
that likely to be?
I don't know. No, we don't know yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
So again, so if you have any, shall we say, minor disputes?
Yeah, things that wouldn't otherwise go to court. So I expect if there's a housing disrepair claim, they may put it to an ombudsman to consider. Who they'll encourage mediation, that sort of thing. But I suspect that sort of stuff will stay through the courts. But it's things like I haven't been allowed a pet, or I haven't had my gas safety certificate. That sort of thing.
Right. Okay. And will this be one ombudsman for the whole country?
That's what they're expecting to see. Yeah, I think they have got the ability to have a couple, but it's expected that it will just be one.
That's going to be a busy office, isn't it?
It is. Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
So all landlords are going to have to subscribe to this.
Yes.
And the powers that ombudsman will have. I think I read that his maximum fine or compensation will be 25,000.
Yes.
But I mean, I think it would have to be a pretty extreme case for that sort of money to be dished out.
Yeah, they're all going to have the power to force a landlord to issue an apology, to stop doing something they're doing. So it might be something like fairly low level breach of quiet enjoyment. If a landlord keeps turning up all the time, that sort of thing. And you do see that, well-intended landlords that keep just popping in and doing the garden.
Yeah.
And that's the sort of, thing they may look at.
Or checking to see if you've got a dog or not.
Yeah, exactly. Issued apology compensation, that sort of thing. So, yeah.
Okay. And I wonder what sort of time that will take, because again, I keep thinking of the person that feels that they've been obstructed or not been treated correctly on their application. I mean, I just have it in my mind that they will be actually focused on finding another property that they can go and rent.
I think so.
And so I just wonder how many of these disputes will actually move forward.
Yeah, who knows?
If there's a complaint.
We're in a culture where people are getting more inclined to complain, people are more inclined to sue. So, I don't know. We'll see. It's big numbers you've got to look after.
I've got to be careful of my words here, and I'll try and be as tactful as I can. But there's also a breed of solicitors that specialise in trying to dig out these rather, I'm going to say, spurious claims sometimes. Yeah,
we've seen a huge increase in it, particularly in housing disrepair. No win, no fee solicitor. You had it with the deposit regulations, no win, no fees on deposit breaches. Deposit breaches have died down, but they're still there. But when it first started, landlords were getting it wrong all the time. So there's huge amounts of claims there, and they do still exist. But now I'm really seeing a drive for housing disrepair from no win, no fee solicitors, and that can be incredibly frustrating for landlords because there's a pre-action protocol, which means a landlord has to respond. And they have a certain timescale for responding, otherwise they can go off and issue their claim. So, we get these letters, and quite often I can deal with them very quickly because they have no merit, but the landlord still had to incur the time, cost and effort to respond to them. So, there's certainly a drive towards that work.
Okay, well, there we are. We're going to take another break now, and we'll come back after the break and conclude our conversations on the new bill. Look forward to seeing you then. Hello and welcome back to the final part of our discussion on the rental reform bill. Welcome back, Carly.
Thank you.
Carly, we've just been talking about the ombudsman scheme and hopefully all the landlords will sign up to that.
It might take a while, but yeah.
I think it might just take a while.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure who's going to enforce it if they don't.
Exactly. Yeah.
Are you?
It's a big challenge, yeah.
But I think the big plus here is that if this helps keep some of the smaller sort of argumentative claims out of court,
free up some time,
then it's going to be worthwhile, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I presume that the ombudsman scheme is going to be funded by contributions from the landlords that join it.
Yeah, it's expected to be a fee. So, yeah.
So, well, hopefully that works. And hopefully it'll give people a relatively speedy access to some mild justice, if you like, if we could term it that way. Yeah. So that's good. I just wanted to come back on one of the subjects that we touched on, which was the exemption of various matters from the eviction scheme and the grounds for eviction. And one of the perhaps most important ones is this student accommodation, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now, if I've read it correctly, it refers to specifically built student accommodation.
Yeah.
Is that right?
At the moment, yes, only purpose-built student accommodation is exempt from these changes. So they won't become periodic tenancies. They'll allow them to continue with fixed-term tenancies to suit the academic year. The pushback on this, and there's been lots of campaigning about it, and I think we've already seen a bit of a U-turn, perhaps, with the government, that they will reconsider the position for private landlords, because at the moment, private landlords will fall into account with everybody else and not exempt from these changes, which presents a really big problem, because actually there's a huge shortage of housing for students, and private landlords are needed to prop that up. And you won't have the certainty, students coming in for that academic year might not have the certainty that student tenants are going to leave. So what happens if they, ready to start in September, and actually the property they all thought they're moving into is not ready, because all of that, household, or one of them perhaps, is not vacated, and it just doesn't match with the academic cyclical, nature of that business. So they are looking at a bit of a U-turn there, I think. Interesting.
Hold on a minute. I'm afraid I was never bright enough to go to university. I'm not that clever, so I don't really know.
You are. Sure you are.
I don't really know how it works. But it seems to me, again, we're getting overcomplicated here. Why don't we just say, if you want to have designated student accommodation, why isn't it the colleges and the universities that become the tenant, and they can simply sublet to their students?
Interesting concept.
On whatever timelines are needed for those particular studies. It just seems to me that with a lot of this bill, we're getting overcomplicated again. We're getting into areas where somebody's got to decide the interpretation of the law.
It's the fun of the law, though. That's the fun bit.
Oh, you might.
For me.
You might. Listen, my ethos in court has always been: can we just keep it simple?
Yeah.
Can we cut the crap? Can we just get to the point? And can we understand where we're going?
That's the problem.
Here?
It's really difficult to keep this simple. And I see your point. There surely has got to be another way, because I don't think, it doesn't make sense for them to fall in line with the rest of the changes.
Well, it also doesn't sit well with me that a student who, shall we say, in property letting terms and probably the ways of the world, is going to be relatively naive at that age, is either negotiating with a highly sophisticated commercial enterprise providing student accommodation, or perhaps a very nice family down the road that says, why don't we let a room off to a student?
Yeah, and it is very different. It's a lot of the time, it's the first time people have ever left home, had any responsibilities. In the pandemic, we saw, students being liable for rent and having to surrender tenancies with them, and, them just upping and going and thinking it was okay not to pay rent. So it's people's first, step into being responsible for, putting a roof over their heads and having to pay their rent. And, it's a bit of a, I think perhaps some baby steps are needed there, and to bring it in line with the other purpose-built accommodation.
I read the reports, and you see these cases. I mean, one of the classic problems with students is where 3 or 4 of them take on a normal apartment that's perhaps, say, £1,000 a month, and 4 of them pay 250 quid each. Great, it's all right. But it is great until one of them leaves. Yeah. And then nobody quite understands the concept of joint and several.
No, they don't. No, and we deal with that a lot. Yeah. And obviously then you've got guarantors involved as well. Because I'd always recommend you have a guarantor for student-let accommodation or any property. I would love to see every single tenancy have a guarantor, whether that would ever happen. But that it becomes quite complicated, and who are they guaranteeing? Whose liabilities are they guaranteeing? So.
And are the guarantors that strong?
Yeah, it's important,
I'm going to just say to you, the Titanic was guaranteed, and look what happened to that. Anyway, look, let's move on to the sort of final sector that we're going to talk about, which is the new property portal. Now, here we are, the government saying we're going to require, or possibly require, all landlords to register on this new portal. Well, I think, again, I'm going to say good luck with that one, because we saw with the NHS portal, didn't we, where we were trying to get people to register and react to signals or memos coming back from an app. How many billions were spent on that, and the thing never even worked. Now, that was a direct government funded thing. It was the NHS that was involved in it also. So you'd think fairly responsible and fairly bright people. Now, I'm not sure who's going to administer this, are you?
It's a big task. Yeah, it is a big task. You look at the numbers that need to go on there. We've got 11 million renters, 2.3 million landlords, and what they'll be required to do is register every potential property they want to let as well. So it's a lot. There's a lot of work to go into it.
Yeah, and then I suppose the next question is, what is it that's going to be registered? I mean, the government are making quite a fuss about wanting to increase the standards.
Yes.
So we've already talked about the increasing the standards and efficiency of energy, insulation and the like. But they're talking about, quality rental properties.
Yeah.
Who determines that quality? Where does the line fall? And how do you register that?
Well, there's all sorts of regulations in place, and it'll be making sure that my understanding is that the gas safeties are on there, for example, energy performance certificates are on there. So if you're looking to rent a property, you can go and see whether that landlord's complied and whether historically they've complied. Banning orders will be registered on there. That's the proposal. Any penalties that a landlord has suffered. So for a good landlord, in theory, it's a positive, because they can say to tenants, come and rent a property from me. I'm a good landlord, I'm compliant, and I've got this to demonstrate. Whereas if you're not a good landlord, then you'd struggle to demonstrate that,
but
you'd be able to weed those out.
What a bad landlord's going to say is, don't worry with all that rubbish, just come and rent off me, I'm cheaper.
And this is the issue we've got, because demand is so incredibly high. Yeah.
So how do you cope with that?
Yeah, it's a big old challenge.
I mean, I think that is the one sector of this bill that just isn't going to happen. I mean, even if they started writing the software for that today, the chances of that being ready in the next 2 years is.
Yeah, and like you say, we have got time, but that's a big project. And again, it's about how long. It's about creating the database, but it's how long for landlords to start to really comply and getting people in line. There's a big educational piece around it as well.
Yeah, so I suppose just taking your point there, we've got time for writing the software, time for bringing in the legislation, deciding how it's enforced.
Yes.
And then, of course, I think in fairness, you would have to allow probably 1 or 2 years as a period of grace for people to register.
Quite generous, 1 or 2 years. But, I suspect that with all of this, there's going to be transitional periods as well. So, you'll have once the legislation comes in place, by the time when you have to comply by, how quick they will be, I don't know. But yeah, we would expect some transitional periods.
So, Carly, the $64,000 question is, what do you think of all this?
It's a lot to get your head around, I think, as a landlord. But I think if landlords understand all of these changes, plan for the change, and get their house in order, excuse the pun, and make sure they've got a team around them that can really help them and support them, they'll do fine. I think there's no time for winging it anymore. I'll give you an example. If you're going to serve a notice yourself, make sure that you get advice on it and that the right grounds are stipulated and that you got advice as to whether you've satisfied those grounds. Do you have the evidence for those grounds, rather than just giving it a go yourself, which I think a lot of people have done for a long time in Section 21, and we've seen that go wrong. So it's about educating yourself and planning for change, looking at your portfolio, making sure this portfolio will work and this business works for you with these changes coming into play.
I think I know from past conversations you work quite closely with 1 or 2 of the software providers for the property industry, and in fact we have a number on our programs here. I've always been very impressed how quickly they're up to date with the legislation, and with this kind of thing, with this new reform, I can quite see that good agents using good software with good controls are going to be worth their weight in gold to a landlord.
Yeah, I agree.
But it does seem to me that what it is going to do is force, shall we say, amateur landlords to become very professional. Yeah. And if they don't, it's going to be very expensive, isn't it?
Yeah, and I just think, and like you talk about amateur landlords, there's no such thing as an amateur landlord. A court considers everybody to be a professional landlord. Yeah. And I agree, software's amazing, and it can make sure that, you really are following all of the requirements, and not just that you can evidence that you followed it as well. So, I'm a huge fan of great software, and there's a lot of agents out there that have great software. I think days are gone where you're just, keeping your little Excel rent sheet, doing a few emails or communicating over WhatsApp. Yes, all that's important, but is it really tracking everything you need it to track to demonstrate that you're compliant? And you look at that database, when you put a property to market, not only do you need, you need to advertise it, but you need to make sure it's on the database as well. So there's a lot to think about. It's be difficult to run this as a side hustle, I think, these days. And actually, it's focusing on it as a business and whether that as a business is right for you. So if you're landlords of one or two, it's quite difficult.
I did tell somebody off the other day if you're using the word side hustle, and I said you have to understand what hustle means, and it's not very good. And they said yes, but it's today's language.
It is. I like it.
So there we are. Well, on that note, I'm going to say a big thank you to Carla Jermyn from Woodstock Legal Services.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. You're obviously the lady to go to on this subject. So you've certainly proved your worth today. Thank you so much for that. I'm Stephen Galpin. Join me again next time on Property Matters.